and welcome to April's Author Nook. I am Jordan H. Bartlett, author of Contest of Queens, Queen's Catacombs, and the soon-to-be-released Queendom Come. And I'm joined today by Alexander James to talk about his debut novel, The Woodkin, a book that, for a solo hiker like me, takes all your worst nightmares and adds an Eldritch Horror to the mix. Welcome, Alex. How are you today?
Hello, I'm delightful. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to talk about this. I'm a big old baby, so I tried to keep it as scare-free as possible, and you'll notice it's daytime when we're having this conversation.
It is. It is. It's a crucial detail.
Very important. Yeah, lights on always. So
Mhm.
we'll get stuck in. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yes. So I am a chef by day and a writer by night. I spend almost all of my time, like 50 plus hours a week, in a professional kitchen. And then I come home, take a shower, and live in my head and talk to imaginary people for several hours. I am a big outdoor enthusiast, if you might not have guessed from this book, but I love hiking and backpacking, spending time in the mountains. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and it's uh, one of the best places in the world to live if you enjoy being outside. So yeah, I love spending any time I can in the mountains.
Incredible. And yeah, the book really does show the voice of someone who knows the wild and like
Mm-hmm.
how, a setting of I'm in the forest isn't just tree, 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 tree. There's so much character in those woods.
Yeah, I've been, I mean, like obviously I've lived elsewhere and been outdoorsy my whole life, but the Pacific Northwest was the first place where like I really felt the character of like outside had something to say. Like it is very unique out here.
Yeah, and hopefully not full of nightmare creatures, but can you tell us a little bit about the Woodkin?
Yes, this book is half a love letter to the Pacific Northwest wilds that I spend a lot of time in, and it's half a horror story about what could happen if you are caught alone out in those woods. The inspiration came from a particularly hair-raising encounter I actually had out. I was hiking. I was like way out in the backcountry, not like the backcountry, but I had like 7 miles away from the trailhead, up over a couple of ridges in the Mount Baker Wilderness by a lake, and I woke up in the middle of the night and I had to pee. And as I was handling the business, I looked up and there was another person staring at me from like 30 feet into the trees, and it was genuinely, genuinely haunting. I don't think I've ever been that scared.
And it was actually a person or a trick of your
It was
imagination?
no, it was actually a person. So what had happened was we had approached the same lake from two different trails because one kind of came up a series of ridges and then another one kind of came around a valley. And so we had just happened to pitch camp around this lake at the same night. And I was going to the bathroom while they were stargazing. And we had a very human moment where I scared the hell out of them. They scared the hell out of me. And then we had this sort of like, are you okay? Because I'm not a little bit. But yeah, I ended up coming back with the idea for this book from that trip.
Oh my gosh. Well, and there's a scene kind of in the middle-ish bit that is
Mm-hmm.
very similar to that, where it's almost like you as the reader are expecting some warning for the instant fear that happens. Because I'm guessing in that moment, you're probably also thinking, oh, I am an apex, not predator, but I'm on the top of the food chain. I have like senses that would alert me if someone was just staring at me. Maybe not.
You know what's so interesting is when I'm out there backpacking and hiking, it's almost the opposite where I'm so keenly aware of my human vulnerabilities because I hike and backpack alone. My partner likes hiking but doesn't particularly care for backpacking. So oftentimes I go by myself. And it's just so curious when I'm walking on like a very thin, spindly trail next to a sheer drop off where it's like, man, one wrong move and nobody's going to find my body. Or, like a starving mountain lion decides that I'm lunch. I've got a blade to defend myself with. It is a uniquely dangerous thing to go and spend time out where you don't have the normal human protections of a building with four walls and a roof.
Yes, yeah, a very humbling experience. And then like you say, you really do feel the kind of the character or the nature of nature is either
Mm-hmm.
there to help or hinder your progress.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't really feel like nature cares which one happens.
No, I had this conversation with somebody the other day where I was musing on growth, like how nature grows. And I was like, nature can't discern good growth versus bad growth. There is only growth. I was like, if you look at that tree outside, it's springtime, the buds are sort of like spindling across this like narrow branch. I was like, I imagine that's what like dead moss growing or moss growing on a dead arm looks like, because there is no such thing as good growth or bad growth. There is just growth. So there is no concept of like predator or prey out in nature. There's just the food chain, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. And rather than a hierarchy, it's just a circle of,
It's just a loop. Yeah.
as James Earl Jones. No, no, who voiced Mufasa? The Circle of
That's
Life?
James Earl Jones. No, you got
Yeah,
it.
James Earl Jones.
The lion eats the antelope eats the grass, and the lion eats the antelope. Therefore, the lion eats the grass. Something
Exactly.
like
So
that.
lions are just vegetarians, is what I took away from that.
Absolutely, they
Yeah.
are. That's right. Grass fed beef.
There you go. And so we mentioned the character of nature in your novel is huge, but our main character is Josh Mallory, who is very relatable. He's got a very distinctive voice throughout the novel, and he really is just a guy. He shines as both likable and the only consistent, normal dude in a rapidly deteriorating reality.
Yeah.
What was your character creation process for Josh like?
So Josh is a pretty even split between myself and one of my best friends who I do go hiking and backpacking with, whose name is not ironically Josh. I didn't burn a lot of brain cells naming the character. But Josh has a lot of elements of me in he's a little bit arrogant, he's a little bit rash. He jumps into the start of this book, or the start of this hike that takes place in the book, with little to no preparation, because he just assumes that everything will turn out just fine. But there is also a piece of Josh that is careful and cautious and methodical, and that is what my the other part of my hiking experience, real life Josh, brings to the table. So I tried to find a way to fuse both of those things in a way that still kept the character voice interesting, as because like things happen in the book that you need a certain perspective to really understand the gravity of. But I also wanted to give that character this like knife edge of arrogant and cautious.
And it was really refreshing to read a character who has obviously done, I mean, he starts the book in a very bad place mentally
Mm-hmm.
because he's just discovered he's been betrayed in the worst possible way. And so it's nice too because he's not kind of stuck in this, everything is awful and I'm just the victim here, because he has done some therapy. So it
Mm-hmm.
was really refreshing to see a character with a voice who would kind of get these moments of I'm about to go off the rails, but then wait, what are 5 things I can see, 4 things I can touch, and rein himself in? Because I think otherwise it could get quite exhausting to just have an explosive, impulsive character all the time. But he has done the work and he's using his strategies.
He's using his skills, baby. You got to use your skills.
And what advice would you give to authors who want to narrow in on a character's voice?
The best way that for me to hone in on a character's voice is to zero draft, just start writing as I think they think, or in their stream of consciousness. And it can honestly sometimes be pure nonsense for a couple hundred words, because when you're trying to hit a character's voice, it's almost like listening to a narration that isn't yours, where you have to think about turns of phrase or pace or picadillos. The character, I started discovering his voice when I started using hyphenated phrases a lot. Like Josh would like link words together to make sentences go by quickly, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, let's pursue that. This was in like draft 1 or 2, I think, of the book. So I think my advice would be just start narrating anything, and try to get as close as you can to how you think your character would talk about it. How would they think about it? What would they focus on? If they're describing a parade, are they focused on the colorful floats? Are they focused on the faces? Do they see somebody suspicious in the crowd? Are they actually suspicious, or is this person paranoid? You know what I mean? Like, just think about what your character would think about.
And then, so that makes so much sense if you're writing a point of view character like Josh, where his voice does dominate. Do you have different tips and tricks for how to get those minor characters' voices? Because we meet a few, again, really distinct characters in your novel, and they all feel like they could just walk straight off the page.
I think it's a similar process. If you're reading your work as a writer and you yourself are having a hard time distinguishing tone, tenor, and voice, I think that's a good area for you to go in and be like, okay, how can I make these different? Like literally, these two characters are speaking too similarly because no two people speak the same. Even in this interview, you and I speak differently. We pause for different times between words. I have a slight stutter. You're very well spoken, and your thoughts come out smoothly in one go. Mine don't. So it's just there are so many tiny imperfections of speech that you can twist into a character to make them feel realized.
Yeah, very true. And then also balancing, because when we're talking in real life, we have these mannerisms that are easy to hear. But if you're trying to translate that to the page, that could probably be where the second edit is going to weed out all of those moments of maybe a stutter or maybe a repeated use of a colloquialism. I'm
Mm-hmm.
currently listening to the audiobook of Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Tolkien, I mean, he doesn't really do much wrong, but he did a really good job with Sam because he'll add those things like, if you catch my meaning, Mr. Frodo, sir, but it's not every sentence.
Right. Yeah. You need enough to distinguish and differentiate. But then if you just hit the same thing at the end of every sentence, it's like, oh, so you're just, yeah, trying to make it different from by dint of brute force and not writing.
Yes, exactly. And this novel was all kinds of unnerving, and you use so many different elements to keep your readers peeking through their fingers. Or at least I know I got sweaty palms for most of the second and third act. From murders, giggling children to shadows that go bump in the night, what were your favorite creepy elements to write?
Man, so I love horror because you can use horror not necessarily as a genre. I don't think of horror as a genre. I think of horror as a filter. You can pass anything through horror, and it's just like playing a song. If you slightly shift to the minor keys, you can change the tenor of any song. You know, I'm sure you've heard of like poppy, punky Disney songs that have been played in minor keys, and all of a sudden they're like a little unsettling. It's still the same song. You're just playing it a little bit differently. So when it came to writing, I tell you what my number one favorite was the child's giggle floating through the woods, because I was writing that scene. This was actually in draft one. I was writing the scene. Josh had something unfortunate happen to him that caused an unnecessary or a necessary detour that he didn't plan for. And I was writing it, and I was in the scene, and I was like, okay, he goes through the woods, and there's a passage where there's no trees because that's cool. He goes, and I was like, there has to be something, like something has to happen. And then literally my fingers wrote, and then he heard a giggle, and I was like, a what? Hello? And I discovered it with the word. Like it was one. It's very rarely do we get those experiences where we, the writer, get to learn what's happening with the character. And it was one of those. So that was probably one of my favorites. Beyond that, I quite liked adding that slight Eldritch horror towards the middle of the second into the third act. I found that very fun to write because at the time I was playing a game called Bloodborne, which features a lot of like Eldritch horror. So it was fun to like tie in my hobby with the book.
Amazing. Yeah, and I love there's so many elements that are just not like you can kind of point to, but you cannot put a direct finger on exactly why this is happening in this way. And it's because I think you kind of breadcrumb the horror for a long time at the beginning. I mean, we meet a dead body, but then it's like, oh, but people die in the woods and it's unfortunate and that's sad, but it's not scary. It's
Mm-hmm.
unnerving, but it's not scary. And then we see like the carcass of a deer, and you're like, oh, that's kind of a very gruesome way that deer has gone. But things die in the woods, and it's probably just a very sharp clawed mountain lion. But I think it was the moment where you hear that giggle where you're like, absolutely not. Like,
Yeah. It's so curious too, because it mirrors kind of my own thinking with things like when does something transition from that's curious to that's worrying. It's like I'm always interested by that spectrum of like certain things happen and you're like, oh wow, that's interesting, or you know, this thing happens and you're like, well, should I be worried about that? I don't think so. But you can never really, like, I'm not worried about that because of X, Y, and Z. You're just not worried about it until you are.
Yeah, and especially for a solo hiker, you don't want to psych yourself out so that you don't finish the hike because you don't want to be like, oh, yeah, I was being silly.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe Josh is pushing himself onward with optimism.
Unwarranted optimism, it has to be said.
And I mentioned a little bit earlier that Josh really sets out on this adventure to process a betrayal. What role would you say trust has in your novel, and how does Josh's trusting nature help or hinder his journey?
I think trust is one of the central struggles that Josh is going through as the main character. The betrayal was sort of the catalyst for him going on this hike that takes place in the book. And it was really important to me that Josh continue to find different facets of this betrayal, because like obviously when you're doing nothing but hiking for 3 weeks straight, you have a lot of time to think. And so I tried to very carefully show that Josh was constantly like uncovering different facets of this betrayal, and how it could have happened from this person's perspective, or how he could have seen it, or how it could have changed this way. Because it is, I mean, the reason that we trust people is complicated and multifaceted and changes daily, frequently. Um, and so I think it also impacted how he encountered everybody else in the novel, because he was already sort of sensitive and fractured in this way. So I think he was looking to repair some of the trust he had lost with the other characters in the novel. I think he was quick to jump to um, close conversations where he might have, you know, had this catalytic event not happened. I think he would have been a little bit more wary of some of these people that he met. But because he was already so fractured, I think it was very easy for him to fall under the spell of like a kind stranger.
Definitely. And you see that really because he struggles a lot with, oh, on the trail, like you don't burden others with your crap because
Mm-hmm.
everyone's got their crap. And he says that a couple of times when he meets first Boots and then Apple Tree. But like you say, he's so eager and he just is seeking that connection that it is quite beautiful. And I'm just thinking the comparison between Boots and Apple Tree, one of them, they're very much like, yes, stick to the code. No, upper lip is stiff. But with Apple Tree, he really breaks down his walls, and we understand why later, but he breaks down his walls quickly and effectively. And then we get this really lovely moment. And I love in novels where you see two guys being vulnerable together and having it be an okay thing that happens. Because I think that's a really important thing on the whole for people to experience more.
100%. And I've been in those scenarios where, because like in, you know, modern society, a man being vulnerable is sometimes seen as lesser or not important. But I've had nights where I've been sitting around a campfire, and I've gone with somebody into those talks where it's like, hey, let's both take a second and talk about some real stuff and feel those feelings. And it's almost easier out in the woods, because like, what are the deer going to do? Judge you? You know, like it's, you're alone, you're by yourself, you're out in this sort of like stripped down version of this conversation where it's the only light you have is from the fire between you. So it's easier to sort of like sink into the shadow and sort of just feel things. It would make a very good boot camp for feelings, I think.
Yes, yeah. And so between we've got, you know, these vulnerable moments, we've got a broken-hearted character, and then we've got all of these nightmares coming to life. What was the most challenging scene to write and why?
Most challenging scene. There is a scene in the crescendo of the book where the sort of nightmares or scary objects from the forest filter into a town that I introduced in the first act. And it was very difficult for me to reconcile normal quote unquote people seeing these sort of like eldritch otherworldly beings, because when I write monster books, or when I wrote this monster book, I guess I should be specific, what's entertaining for me and what's fun to read is the allure and mystery around the thing. Like I want to hear about this twig snapping in the distance. I want to hear about hearing monstrous, huge breath panting. I want to feel like the air warming as this thing gets closer and closer to where I'm hiding. But as soon as you show the thing, as soon as the tension breaks and you're like, oh, that's what it looks like, that's what it looks like. Like I am not so much focused on what it is as much as I am how it makes you feel. So I struggled to reconcile like the normal people of this town seeing these monsters, because there were natural questions that I didn't care to answer. And my agent and editor both did very good jobs helping me revise this book, because they were like, no, you have to answer some of these questions. Like somebody has to say, where did they go? And you have to have an answer to that. And I was like, why? Like, it doesn't matter. It's they're, but there they are. You've seen them. They're scary now. And then let's move on. And they were like, no, you have to stop and actually like answer some of these questions and ground the monsters in reality, because otherwise they're just hollow spookiness. And it's like, that's not satisfying. So I think that was probably the most difficult thing to write.
That's fair. Yeah, you can't just go off of, but the spooky vibe though. Can we
Yeah,
maintain that?
but scary.
Yeah. And it is hard too when you have an image in your mind, and we're so careful a lot of the time to show, not tell. And so then when you do have to do those, I know I struggle as well, where you have to do those, well, this is why this happened moments. You don't want it to feel like a side character being like, and that's because of the equinox that caused this reaction. Like
100%. Yeah, you can't really rely on the reader picking up all of the subtle clues that you're dropping.
yeah, definitely. And what is something that you included in your novel that you nerd out over?
Oh, Dungeons and Dragons, 100%. I think I put D&D in every book I write. Somehow, even if it's in there a little bit.
And I do love, because which I'll actually put the link to our Dungeons and Dragons podcast, where we got to play our characters with the wonderful MC who just created a world with 3 worlds in it. Well, 4 if
So
you're
cool.
including the margins. And Elijah Menchaca, who was playing his character Phoenix, and then Jess, who was Daffodil Pickle.
Yep.
Who basically the MVP of the day, because she
Honestly, God, she was so great.
But I love when you find that an author is also into Dungeons and Dragons, because you immediately understand a few things, and it's in those subtle ways that like characters are introduced and information is shared in the story. It really does have almost like a D&D flavor, if that makes sense, compared to other authors. And I'm not saying one is worse or better, but it really does kind of flavor how a story unfolds if you're used to creating a story with others in a certain way.
It's true. And I tell people this a lot. I tell writers and other authors, it's like, hey, like playing Dungeons and Dragons or any sort of like tabletop role playing game is so great to practice storytelling, because it's collaborative storytelling. You are telling a story while trying to hold and respect the space that each other person has to tell their story. I'm trying to tell the story of one character, you're trying to tell the story of another, et cetera, and so forth. And so we're all trying to build towards something together. And like, you can do the same thing in your book if you sort of use that mentality of like, how do I tell this story from all of these perspectives while respecting what each person wants to do and bring to the table.
Yes, and I think too, the ability to yes and your own ideas is really important, because sometimes you do get stuck, like you were saying before, where you're like, okay, we're in the woods, it's really cool, there's no trees around, and then you hear the giggle of a child and you're like, yes, and like it helps that kind of natural, like, oh, this would be cool, let's see if I can set it up so that it makes it to the final draft.
Yeah, and there are times where you'll yes and yourself and it won't be good, and that's fine too. Like, one of the hardest things for me to do personally is to go through a draft and be like, this isn't as good as I need it to be, can I fix it? Or is it sort of a select all and delete moment? Like we can't keep 100% of what we write from draft zero into the finished book. So there are times where like I'll have an idea and I'll write it out and flesh it out. And then I'll come back to it in a few months and be like, not very good.
But it's better to do that than publish something that you're going to look back at, 10 years later and be like, I wish I had just gone with my gut, axed that scene, because even though it's a lovely scene, there are ways to tweak things so that it maybe comes maybe it comes back later in a different way, or you save it for a sequel. But if you keep in everything just because you're like, well, I wrote it and it must be good, you're going to do yourself a disservice.
It's a tough thing to approach because you say like, I worked hard on this, therefore people should want to read it. And that's not always the case. Just because you worked hard on something doesn't mean it's the best version of what you're trying to say.
Exactly. Yes. Can you share a favorite quote or passage that you kind of live by or write by?
Absolutely. Yes. It is from a Stephen King work, because as a horror writer, I think I'm required to have a few Stephen King quotes that I sort of dispense and nerd out over. But in one of his books called The Gunslinger, he has a character say, "Go then, there are other worlds than these." And I think about that every time I sit down at a keyboard, is because like there are so many other worlds out there, both mine and other people's, and like, why wouldn't you want to spend time in them? It also says a lot about like where you're comfortable and how that should always be accepted.
Yes, and it's a lovely thing that we as humans, just to get really really deep, we as humans can do is we can create these worlds for others to live in and to process emotions, events, ourselves, but also then help others process those things, or just make them realize like, okay, when I hike by myself, I'm going to make sure my knife is not in the bottom of my pack, my flint is going to be in my pocket, and I'm going to maybe wear a belt full of salt just in case.
Just in case. You never know.
You never can tell. Doubles as a garnish, but also what if there are ghosties? I don't know. Salt seems to be helpful.
Or slugs, ghosts or slugs, salt's got your back.
Yeah, that's a 2-for-1 if
There you go.
if I ever shared one. Do you have any projects coming up that you're excited about?
Yes, I am currently out on sub with my agent with another horror novel. It is a little bit more YA flavored and a little bit more uh portal fantasy, like doors that lead you to otherworldly places, but that exists very much in this imagination creation space that was a lot of fun to write. It started with me think like I was car camping with my wife in the Olympic Peninsula, and I thought like, what if in one of these like hillsides there was just a door that led into the hillside, but like not a Hobbit door, but like a really gnarly, messed up door with scary stuff inside. And I wrote a whole book about that, and it's a lot of fun.
Amazing, like a nope door.
Yeah, exactly. Like a no thank you door.
Yeah. Oh, that's very exciting. So, thank you so much for joining me today for our chat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put the links to your socials in the episode description. I'll also put the links to our recent D&D podcast with MC in there, because it was a bunch of fun and it was such a delight getting to chat with you
So good.
again. This time I'm out of armor and you are no longer, well, you are still a guy, but you don't have a
I'm
battle
still just a
rifle.
guy. I'm always just a guy.
Just a guy showing us how it's done. So thank you so much to all my listeners for joining our chat. If you liked what you heard, please take a minute to rate and follow this podcast or share it with like-minded friends. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I release new episodes once a month with no set date, so a subscription on either Spotify or YouTube means that you won't miss anything. However you wound up here, I hope you're well and living magically.